Hey guys, this is MoglyphFX aka Frebox. This video is a tutorial about recreating some of the After Effects components with MoglyphFX. So without any waiting, let's go ahead and get starting. The very first thing we are going to create with MoglyphFX is the bounding box that allows you to transform layers inside After Effects. These are these 9 little squares here with a centered anchor point. How do you do that with MoglyphFX? As you will see, it's really easy. So, I'm gonna create a grid cloner with MoglyphFX, which is this tool here, if you don't know it. And to do so, I will choose the grid cloner. But before that, I will choose the font that I need for this sake. And if you don't know about them, I just remind you that you can find a really useful PDF with the appendix of all the contained fonts with MoglyphFX on the website. So I will use for this sake the Moglyph Motion Design font. So select this and create a grid cloner. By default, it will create this kind of shape. Of course, this is not what I want. I want perfect squares and I want something that looks like an anchor point. So I will just click on my cloner grid again and click on Add New Glyph. And as you can see, there are a lot of cool shapes, but I just need these little squares here that are the number 72 in the grid of glyphs. So I will click on this one and just keep in mind that I will use then this guy here, which is the number 85, because this is the shape that represents the most realistically the anchor point of a layer. So again, this is 85, but now I will create these little squares by clicking on that guy, and I will close the window. And now I have a grid full of these little squares. I need exactly 9 little squares centered on my layer. So I will click on Moglyph Cloner in the Effect panel, and I will twirl down the object, and I will change the count on X by 3 and the count on Y, so for the rows, by 3 as well. And now I have something that looks like the grid that was showing when I select a layer in After Effects. So I want this guy here again. And I just want to replace the centered one by the anchor point, so the 85 glyph, okay? So how do I do that? I will select my layer again, and I will go to the Animate tab and choose the plane Effector. Normally you should see all your clones colorized in red color, and you should see them go upward like that. But if you reset the Effector plane here, you won't see nothing at all. So at this moment you can just select again your Effector plane, and you can go to the parameters other, and I just want to remove the shape and change it by choosing another number of glyph. And as a reminder, if you click on your cloner, click on Add New Glyph, this is the shape I want, and it's number 85 if I go over with my cursor here. So as you can see, there is an option here that is called Modify Glyph. By default this is 0, but if I change this by 85, all my glyphs are now some anchor point shapes. So this is great. It's a bit too thin, so I want to add kind of a thicker look, and I will change this later. But for the moment, I just want to change the range of my Effector plane just because I just want to keep the squares here around, but just have this shape at the center. How do I do that with MoglyphFX? Well, this is a text animator, so I will twill down the fall off here, and I will just put the smoothness not from 100% but 0%, and I will play with the completion from and the completion to parameters just to ensure that I will be there in the range. Okay, so it should be around 50. So just before 50 you can type in something like 49, for example, and something like 51, and boom, you have exactly what you want. Okay, so I find this design too thick here and not enough thick here, so I want to rescale a bit the squares, and to do so this is really easy. You just need to go to the glyph one that I added before, transform, and I will scale on X and Y by let's say changing by 50% instead of 100, and now you have something a little bit more realistic. And of course all the clones have been rescaled, and even this one. So but you have the control now over your anchor point, because all the effector plane here will deal with the anchor point only, because we have selected the range at the center here. So I can then deploy the parameters of the effector plane, go to transform, and you can rescale it as you want. So you can go crazy and add this kind of settings. It's a bit too much. I would prefer something a bit smaller. Okay, and if you find it too thin, you can even play with the, so let's twill up the transform, the other, and I want the style this time. Okay, effector plane style in the parameters, and you can play with the stroke thickness. So if I cheat a bit and I add a bit of stroke, let's say 2 for example, as you can see the design is now much clearer. Okay, so the only thing is that the color of the stroke depends of this color here, and the color of the fill depends of this one, and the colors come from the cloner, and the cloner has this color here. So you will have to go to the Moglyph cloner, transform, and the fill color is nice. I want to leave this color here, but if you want to have, let's say, a red, you will change this here, for example. Okay, but I want to live with this greenish color because I love it. But you have to ensure that the stroke color is the same as the fill color. Okay, so just with the little eyedrop here, you can click on that and change to have the same than the fill color. And now you have something that is perfect. Okay, so this is the typical bounding box of a layer that allows you to transform your layers in After Effects. Okay, great. So how do I do now in order for me to stick to a specific layer and to adapt in dimensions depending of its source? So to do that, I will remove the solid here, and I will create, let's say, a text. And I will, oh, sorry, this is the a Moglyph font, so I will, let's say, choose a Bebas font, for example. Okay, great. Really important in this, if you do that for a text, for example, ensure that your text is exactly at the scale of 100 by 100. So just play with the character size in the character panel in order to resize your text. Okay, cool. So I will put the text below the cloner, okay? And I will just select my cloner and parent it to the text layer. And now, if you move your text layer, of course, your grid will follow. And this is perfectly adapted because this is what the transform bounding box of a layer that you see in red here is doing, right? So I will undo this. So my layer is now parented to the text layer. And now, so I will twill up all my effects here. I just want the Moglyph cloner effect, just tidy up the things a bit. So I will just go to the object. And you have to know that any glyph on MoglyphFX is based on a 100 by 100 square size. So if you zero out the gap here, you won't zero out the space between all the glyphs because my glyph is smaller than 100 by 100 in my design. So if you have a see, and so if you look at the this glyph that I have chosen here, this thing here is 100 by 100. So if I type here in the X gap minus 100, and if I do the same thing in the Y gap, so minus 100, as you can see, all my glyphs are now at the exact same place. And this is cool because I have zeroed out all the dimensions. I just have now to calculate with some expressions the width and the height of my parent layer. So don't be afraid, it will be really easy and fast to do. So click on your Moglyph cloner grid and alt click on your X gap firstly, okay? And let's make some room here. Just select your property here, the X gap, type SS on your keyboard, so you have only this property that is displaying. Okay, so in the X gap, just type parent dot source rect at time, so you have the auto completion for you, and after the parenthesis just type dot and width. And I want to calculate the gap between each clone, so I will have a clone at the center and a one here, so I want to calculate the half of the width. So the half of the width is calculated by /2, right? So this is great, and don't forget I want to zero out the initial size, so I will type minus 100, okay? So as you can see, it works perfectly well. So how do I do that for the y-axis? Well, you can just copy and paste your expression, so copy, alt click on y gap, okay, and paste this one too. Of course, if I do so, it won't be the exact height because I've just left the width word. So change the width keyword by height, like that. Okay, and now, as you can see, if I take my text, the grid corresponds exactly to the size of my text layer. And this is great because you have now something that is working perfectly. So if you don't want to touch to your grid, you can lock your layer and just play with your text layer now, okay? And whichever word I type, the bounding box will auto adapt, which is pretty cool. Okay, so one thing you can do to make it even better is if you want to rotate your, so let's uncheck this eye here, and if you want to select your layer and later you want to rotate it or to animate your rotation, as you can see, the little squares here won't rotate with the layer, and neither the anchor point. As you can see, the anchor point and the squares remain perfectly horizontal and vertical. So how do I do that? Well, it's pretty easy too. You can select your layer again and go to MoglyphCloner, Transform, and just Alt-click on the rotation Z, okay? Again, this is a little expression, really easy to understand. It will be minus parent dot rotation. And now, if I select my text, if I rotate it, as you can see, the anchor point and the squares remain perfectly straight. So this is really cool, and the nice thing is that if I create, let's say, a shape layer, and let's say create a poly star, and I prefer a regular shape like this one, for example, or a polygon. Yeah, right, you get the idea. And if I had a fill, for example, okay, this one is a bit harsh, so something like this is prettier. Okay, I will put it below my grid, and if I change the parent now not to be my text but my shape layer, as you can see, it will automatically adapt to its content. This is pretty cool, and the only thing you need to make it work is to ensure that your layer is exactly centered on your composition, okay? But now, if you do so, it will work as expected. A cool thing you could do to add to its usefulness, so it could be cool to make it pop to the correct position if you move your parent like this, okay? And to do that, it's really simple. Just select your grid again, type P on your keyboard to display the position property, Alt-click on it, open some square brackets, and type 0, 0, okay, 0, 0. And now, if I change the parent, it will automatically pop to the correct position, which is really, really cool. So this is it. You can, the nice thing of it is that you can select your Moglyph grid cloner and save this to be a preset. So to do that, just drill down all the things that are contained in your text layer, okay? And you have to select some of the text group, some of the effect group, and some of the transform group. So be sure to take the position, anchor point, effector plane, Moglyph cloner, glyph 1, effector plane, cloner grid spacing, glyph, cloner transform, more options, path options, and source text. So with all these selected, you can just take it and drag them in your effects and presets folder, which is right there. So click on that and drag them here on the animation presets. And this window should pop out, and I will register this one on the desktop in my case, because I don't have the right authorizations in my After Effects folder. So I will call it, for example, Auto Layer Controls Box, and this is an FFX preset on my desktop. Okay, and now if I copy that inside my preset folder inside After Effects, so After Effects preset, copy this here. Okay, as you can see, this is right there. This is called Auto Layer Controls Box. If I return in After Effects, if I remove this guy here. If I type in my effect preset, you won't find it now because you have to refresh the list. So how do I do that? I go to the little hamburger menu here, and you have a refresh list here. Click on that, and now if I type auto, you will find the auto layer control box. And since I have included the text source, it will recognize that this is a text layer. So if I don't select anything in my comp and double click on this, it will create a text layer for me, which is pretty cool, right? So my layer is here, and of course there is nothing that works really because I need a parent. So now if I display my text, okay, and if I take my empty text layer that I can rename auto controls box, for example, I can create this. So I can take it and just parent it to my text layer. And as you can see, there is a little problem here because you just see some letters. Well, it's really easy to fix that. You just need to select the correct font because, again, this is nothing but a text layer, right? MoglyphFX deals with text. Okay, so select your layer again, go to the character panel and choose Moglyph. As you can see, these are all the fonts that are contained in the product, and just find the latest one, which is Moglyph Motion Design here. And boom, it works perfectly again. So yeah, this is it. It works really, really well. This is pretty cool. You can use it in a lot of situations, especially if you are a script or After Effects tool creator to do your own demo videos. And you can even use this if you have to create some videos or motion pieces about motion or about video or about animation for your clients. So, yep. The second thing I wanted to show you that you could recreate with Moglyph really easily is how to create a stack of layers like this with some randomly placed keyframes from various keyframes shapes, just like you see here, which is pretty standard with different type of layers: composition, footage, solids, shape layers, text and nulls, and some different kind of shape of keyframes, right? So to do that, you just need to create a grid cloner again, and for this one I will select a basic geometry. So basic geometry is the very first one, so create a grid like that. Go to your Moglyph cloner and play with the twill down the object subgroup, play with the count on X and type 1 because I just want one stack, okay? One stack with layers below and upper, okay? And you can add as many layers you want, so I will type 7 in my case, and just twill down the transform menu, rescale the square like this, and the scale on X. This will be my layers, just like the one you see there, okay? So, once you have done that, you can just select your layer, your Moglyph layer, and go to Animate and click on Random, right? As you can see, it will instantly change the scale and the color of my layers. So I don't really want that, but I want to have some colors that are randomly distributed among a selected range of colors, just like the labels that you see there, okay? So to do that, please ensure that you are in your Moglyph cloner effect again, in transform, And the fill color has to be a perfect 50% gray, okay, a neutral gray. Okay, and you can put the stroke color to the exact same color if you want to. I prefer to do that because you can sometimes end up with a little fringe here, which isn't exactly color that you want. So I prefer to have the same color in fill and stroke color. And I don't want to have this random rescaling animated here. So go to the effect random, twill down the effector subgroup, choose the random mode to be random, not wiggle, but random. And normally you should see an animation, but which is with kind of cut old keyframes here, which is exactly what I want. So if you want to have an animation with different kind of setups, you can leave the animation on, but for the sake of this tutorial, I don't want that. So I will leave the animation speed to 0. So I will end up with a perfectly still composition. Okay? So once you have done that, you can twill up this one and twill down the parameters subgroup. Go to transform, and this is because the scale X has been changed by default. I don't want that. I want to 0 the scale X here, and the scale Y will follow because by default the link dimensions are on. Okay, so once you have done that, you can just play with the position X, and as you can see, it allows you to recreate the kind of thing you have when you do that. And this is what happens in a realistic scenario in After Effects. So the in points and out points of your layers won't be perfectly regularly distributed. So this is how I do that, just by playing with the position X here. Okay, great. So the value here depends on what you want to achieve. Let's type 3050 here. And the last thing I want to do is to go to style. Okay. And I don't want the fill hue to be changed. So I don't want the one turn that I put it by default. I want to type 0 here. And as you can see, I have now a perfect gray that comes from this color here. But I want to be changing the fill brightness and the stroke brightness. So I will put 100 here and 100 in the stroke brightness as well. So you should end up with some perfectly black values here and here, for example, and some perfectly white, and some in-betweens grayscale values. This is great because now I can apply on top of that, if I twill up this guy, make some room, if I apply the effect color correction Colorama, I can change the colors from there. So in the Colorama, you can change the output cycle and just untick the interpolate palette because I want straight separations of colors. And for each color, I will replace in the default rainbow, I will replace the colors with the eyedrop here by the colors of my labels here. Let's say, for example, the color of a composition, which is this color. Okay. I can change the one to be this reddish color, the one that is used by After Effects to identify the nulls and the text layers, for example. I can change this guy to be the blue color that usually is used for shape layers. And you can change this guy to be this lavender color that is used by footage. And this last color here, it's the same for footage too. And if you have too much colors, you can just remove them, or you can add them if you want to. I like to have more colors from a few types of layers. For example, I want to have more footage, for example, and less blue, more red. Okay, something like that, for example. And this will be a nice color scheme that mimics perfectly what After Effects does when you have a timeline. Okay? So this is my stack of layers at the moment. So once you have done that, let's create now the keyframes. Okay? So double your layer just by clicking on your cloner grid and Control or Command D on Mac. You have a second grid, and from there just remove the Colorama effect. Okay, and on this second grid here, you can just go to the Moglyph cloner, go to the transform, do a scale X to 100% and scale Y to 100% as well. So you retrieve some perfectly squared squares. So you have the normal default shape from geometric, the Moglyph basic geometric here. And you have to take attention to the color of keyframes in After Effects. If you don't select a keyframe, it will be a light gray color. And if you select some keyframes, they will turn in blue. Okay, so the grayish color here can be achieved in the fill color. And I will choose for that, let's say, I can just pick the color from there, for example. Perfect. This is 69%. And I can select the same color for the stroke color. And I can go to the Effector random. I don't want to colorize the brightness to have a change in the brightness of my clone, so I will go to the Effector random, parameters, style, and I will zero out the fill brightness and the stroke brightness. And now I have retrieved the perfect gray square from the default state. So now I just have to change the default square by some different variations of keyframes shapes. To do that, you can select your grid layer and just change the font and choose the Moglyph Motion Design font again. This is the one I used for the transform bounding box in the previous section, and this is where you'll find some keyframes shapes too. So click on Motion Design and click on Add New Glyph. As soon as you do so, this panel opens, and you can just click on the different shapes you have here, the one you want. Okay, and I will select, for example, this guy, this one, this one, and this one, and this one. I don't want this one because it is not really a type of keyframe in After Effects, but the other one are perfectly. Okay, so I can close this guy. Okay, and as you can see, if I solo this guy here, I have now some different shapes. Okay, and of course I want not only one keyframe by layer, but several keyframes on each layer. And this is when you will drill down again your Moglyph cloner. And don't forget that initially, when we created the layers here, we had chosen to put exactly one single column here. But for the keyframes, I can change this to whichever number I want, and I can, for example, do that. Okay, so I will, for example, add, let's say 7. And I have now exactly 7 keyframes on each layer here. So this is great, and as you can see, because I have the random effector here that is changing the position X, I have some keyframes here that are moving on the X-axis, which is perfectly great because there isn't always the same amount of gap between each keyframe. So this is cool, but I don't want the keyframes to overlap. So I will ensure that the value I put here in my position X in the random effector aren't superior to 100. So I can type in, for example, 80, and now no keyframe will overlap with each other. If I want more room between my keyframes, I can go to the Moglyph cloner and play with the gap value here. Okay, so I can adjust that a bit, for example, and this is cool. So I can just now select my layer again. I can, for example, rename this keyframes, and I can rename the other one layers. And yeah, I can move the keyframe layer just a bit above the layers once. Okay, and I can just recenter all this a bit in my composition. And now you have something that looks like exactly what you have here. So to be a little more realistic, I can just create a background. Okay, I will pick the gray color from the background here. I will put this lastly here. And the keyframes are way too big, so I can go to the keyframes. I can go to the Moglyph cloner, twill down the transform, and resize the scale of all your clones at the same time a bit. So let's say, for example, 75 by 75. Yeah, this is way better for me. If you want to have more or less room between each layer here, just like in the actual After Effects timeline, you can just, in both layers, play with the Y gap. So if I reduce the gap between my layers here, the value that I type in one layer has to be the same in both layers, right? So if I, let's say, put 8 here in the Y gap, in the layers layer, I can do the same in the Y gap. I can choose to enter 8 as well. So now this is a little bit more realistic again, just in After Effects. If you find your layers to be too big in the 8, I can then play with the scale Y in the Moglyph cloner again. So I can do something like this or something like this. Yeah, this is perfect. Okay, so there is one thing that I don't like here. This is that each keyframe iterates and cycles through this list of glyphs, because this is by default on the iterate mode here. As you can see, this one, this one, this one, you can retrieve this configuration again and again, and I don't want that. I want to randomize my keyframe shapes. So to do that, you just have to go to the Moglyph cloner of your keyframes layer, and in the clones inside object subgroup, click on randomize. And now you have something more random. And be careful, because the further you go inside towards the top of the stack here, the less you will find in instances of these shapes. And this is the order that I created the guys here. So I clicked for the first one was this one, I think, yeah, 71, 71. Then I clicked secondly on this one. So I will find way more of this and more of this, a bit less of this, bit less of this, even less on this, and less again on this. So if I want more of that and less of, let's say, the toggled, maintained old keyframe, I can just put this guy here at the top of the stack, and it will change the shape of my, yeah, oh, this is not really that. Okay. So no, I was wrong, sorry, this is the inverse. So this guy here won't appear that much in the, so you can play with the order of the stack. So if you find you haven't got enough diamond shape here, you can move things in the stack and it will change the overall look. So just play with them. Okay. And actually this is a bit of a problem because right now I don't find any easy is keyframes. So I will show you a second way of doing this. So I will remove all this. I will select all of my glyph. I will go to Help Matte panel and remove glyph. So now I just end up with the default first shape of the motion design font. And now how do I do to have some random shapes among my shape layers? So I will select my keyframe layer again. I will click on Add New Glyph, and I will just go to the Add New Glyph glyph panel again, and I will count how many of these shapes I want. Okay, so I want some of this, 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 and some of this, but not that one. So I have exactly 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different shapes to pick from. And I will rely on the random effector to randomize the distribution between my different shapes. But to do so, I have to ensure that I can pick the correct middle clones in my range, so that a random effector will pick on the left and will pick on the right. But the problem is here with 6 different clones, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that I don't have a centered glyph in the 6. So I will have to add 2 ranges of 3 glyphs. So I will pick this one, and the random effector will pick one randomly on the left and one randomly on the right. And the second one will be this one, and it will pick one on the left and one on the right. So I have to click on this guy and this guy to be exactly in the correct range. So click on this one and this one. Okay, so now I have exactly the same amount of easy ease keyframes and the same amount of old keyframes here. But now in the effector random, I can go to the parameters, other, and I can just offset the glyph, which means that if you go here, I was there. So if I offset the glyph, it will by 1 here. Let's do that. Okay. So if I do that, it will offset the glyph to be exactly, so I was there, to be exactly here or here, because the random effector can go in both sides. It can go on a maximum to 100 and minus 100, so it will go on the left in the grid. So as you can see, it works perfectly well. Now I have the full range of different shapes variations. So I can close this guy, and be careful, because if I enter 2, it will go to too far in my grid and I don't want that. So be sure to be at 1 exactly. And you can play with the source here to obtain a different, to obtain some different variations. And yeah, if I do that, yeah, you can see with the 2 here that I don't have the full range. I have go over here, so it's not what you want. So keep it simple, keep it with 1 glyph only. So now that you have created your different keyframes shapes, and again you can modify the seed here and the seed here if you want to change the distributions. What I want to do now is to colorize randomly some of the keyframes to be blue, like the ones I can see here in the reality. To do so, I will just finally, I will select my keyframes layer. I will go to Animate. I will go to Plane. And by default, you will see all your clones be pushed towards the top and be colorized in red. I don't want that. Okay, so reset it and nothing will happen. So if I want to colorize a keyframe, I have to select 1 keyframe, for example, to have the correct blue color. And I will go to my Effector plane, parameters, style. I don't want to check the colors from Cloner because I want to colorize my keyframes. And now if I select that, I can take the pick, the eyedrop tool from there for the fill color. I will, oh sorry, it will disappear every time I'll do this. So let's change, let's pick a blue in my After Effects layout, yeah, because if it's the same blue than for keyframes, I think, yeah, this is the correct blue. So some of my keyframes have to be gray and some have to be blue. So how do I do that? And I want it to be random. Well, I can play with the fall off here. So until down the fall off and play with the completion here. But be careful because by default it will be a smooth transition. So you can see here that I have a gray, a blue, but there is something in between here and I don't want that. So to ensure that it will be perfectly blue and perfectly gray, I have to reduce the smoothness in the fall off to 0. And now this is exactly what I want. So the cool thing with that is that you can select a range of keyframes. So I can tell that I select only the range, okay, from these guys to these guys, and it's almost like I had taken my mouse and selected them by drawing a rectangle here, which is pretty cool. But if you want something more random, you can always select your Effector plane, and in the Moglyph Animate tab, just click on FX fall-off options, randomize fall-off order. So be sure to select your Effector plane before and click on randomize. And now if I play with the completion, you will see a perfectly randomized selection. And the more you have in the range, the more you have in gray, or the less you have in gray. Okay, so if I have 0 to 5, I will only have a few of them selected, right? But if I have 0 to, let's say, 90, you will have a lot of keyframes selected. So this is it, and this is the end of this part. So I hope you guys will like it. And lastly, I want to show you how to completely change the look of that. Well, you just have to go to the layers and you can play with Effector random again, and you can play with the source here. As you can see, you have some nice variations from the colors range, but you can even animate that, right? This is a Effector random has random mode, but it's animatable. So if I do animation speed, if I type, let's say, for example, 3, and if I change this in the Effector random from the keyframes as well, so Effector 3, if I press play, as you can see, I have now some different timelines compositions automatically created for you, which is pretty cool. So yeah, this is it for this part. I hope you like it. Okay, so the last thing I'm gonna show you is how to recreate this code editor from After Effects. So what I basically want to reproduce here is that. As you can see, if you alt-click on a chronometer in After Effects, you have some expression editor. Anyone already knows that, but here is what I want to recreate. So you have some various width for every word on a line. You have some white spaces between lines. You have some indents sometimes, and a specific color scheme. As you can see, there are some blue color for some keywords, white color for variables, yellowish color for methods, and reddish color for strings. So this is what we're going to create, and I want to be not too specific with the design, so I want it to be blocky, like exactly that. And yeah, it can be really useful for a lot of situations, especially if you want to create some development and coding video stuff. So we are going to recreate this from scratch, except for the background that I've already prepared for that. Okay, so the first thing you need to create is this range of numbers here, because this is specific to coding interface. It's a mono type of font. So let's do this. You could, of course, create this with a simple text layer, but I prefer to do this with MoglyphFX because I will have the control over the vertical spacing pretty precisely, and I will be able to match the exact same one that I will use for the lines here. So how do you do that with MoglyphFX? Well, there is a very special mode in MoglyphFX that is called manual. By default, you'll always be in procedural, which means if you create, let's say, a radial cloner, you will be able to procedurally create some various arrays of clones in a procedural way. But if I create it manually, it will be really different. It will ask you to enter your own words. And this is what I want, because I want to use that to be able to enter my own numbers. So I will create a new grid cloner with a manual mode. I could have used the linear cloner because it's a simple line that is vertical, but the problem is that the clones will be centered on the very first clone from there, and the grid of lines will be centered on the vertical, so it won't match. So I prefer to have two different grid cloners for that. So click on manual, click on grid cloner, and there is this little message that is popping up. You can read it if you want. Okay, and now if I reselect my grid cloner, I can rename these numbers, for example, or lines numbers. Okay, so I reselect my layer, and now I can double click on it and enter all the numbers I want. So I can type in 1, I enter 2, enter 3, enter for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15, for example. Of course, this is very strange for now, because you have a MoglyphFX, a Moglyph basic geometry font used here. But as you have seen before, you have to choose the correct font for that. And this is, I will use an Handel mono type for that font, because code editors always have a mono font. Like you can see a nice kind of 0 here, which is specific to development fonts. Okay, so let's select your line numbers again and select an mono here. So you can type mono, for example, in your character panel, and you will see all the mono font available on your system. Mine is Handel mono, so I will select this one. Okay, cool. So now I have the advantage to have both some editable text and the benefits from the Moglyph cloner. So as you can see, I can now go in my line numbers, effect panel, and you have a Moglyph cloner, and I have entered manually exactly 15 numbers. So I can deploy the object subgroup, and I can enter the count y to be exactly the same number. So I can enter 15, and now the spacing is even, and it's perfectly centered on the middle clone. Okay, so now I can play with the y gap here, which is way too much, and I want to have the very first clone to be at the top of the composition and the last one at the bottom of the composition. So something like minus 25 should be great. So I want to give the impression that I have cropped a part of the code editor, so it's nice to have, yeah, something like that. Minus 28 for me, and I am in a composition that is exactly 1080. Okay, so now I have my numbers, and the good thing is that this is still an editable text, so I can select it and change the paragraph mode to be justified on the right. Okay, perfect. And I can move that here. I can colorize it to be the color of the editor, which is grayish. Okay, to do that, you won't be able to change it in the character panel, but you will be able to change it in the Moglyph cloner, since we have generated it with a grid cloner, in the transform here, and this is the fill color, so I will change it there. Okay, I will choose a perfectly neutral gray. Okay, so this is it for the number part of it. Okay, let's leave it like this for now. Be careful, because if you stay with manual, you will probably not understand what's going on for the following parts. So be careful and click on procedural again, which is the default state of MoglyphFX, because now we are gonna create some lines procedurally. Okay, this is the standard mode of Moglyph. Okay, so let's create the lines. And to do that, I will create another grid cloner, and I will leave the Moglyph basic geometry, which is the default one. So click on create. And I have now a cloner grid. I will select it and enter in the object. I want exactly 15 rows, just like I have 15 numbers on the left. And I will enter a count of, let's say 7. Okay, great. And just by the way, the line numbers by default will stay with the count X 8 columns, but in fact you have only 1 column, because each time I entered the number, I have entered the enter key on the keyboard, so I have created a new line, so it will ignore the other columns here. But yeah, you can just type in 1 if you prefer to be precise, but in fact it won't change anything in my case. Okay, so let's go down back to the Moglyph cloner grid. Okay, you can rename it code lines, for example. And yeah, so first thing to do is to go to transform and rescale it on the y-axis, just to be able to have something that looks like more like words on a line. Okay, so you have to downsize it a bit. So I will, for the sake of the tutorial, I will make it 50% on the scale Y. And as you can see, the spacing doesn't match, but if I go to my line numbers and see here which number I have entered on this Y gap here, which is exactly in my case minus 28, I can then go to the code lines layer and enter the exact same amount here. So I can go to Y gap and type minus 28, and now you have something that is pretty accurate. So next thing to do is to ensure that all your clones will touch each other. So to do that, again, if you have not forgotten what I've said before, you can zero out the gap just by going here in the X gap and type 0. Okay, so all my clones are now touching each other, and I want now to randomize the width of each word and the color of each clone. So to do that, I will just use a random effector. So click on your layer again and just apply a random effector. And once you have done that, you can go again to your layer, and the effector random is by default changing your clones by linking dimensions, but I don't want that. I just want to keep the height of each clone and just affect the X with the X size of my clones. So to do that, just deploy the effector random, deploy the effector subgroup, and uncheck the link dimensions. Okay, so now I can go to the parameters, transform, and I can play with the scale X, for example. Okay, so this is how I will change the width of my different words. Again, keep in mind that this will be some coding lines, so it's up to you the value you put there. The problem is that if you go too far, some words will disappear and have a negative value. So to avoid this, you have to go to the minimum here, which is there, as you can see, below the effector subgroup. And the minimum is minus 100 by default, but just type 0 to zero it out. Okay, so now if I play with the X scale, as you can see, I can't have negative scales if I have a positive value in the scale X. So type something that you like, something like maybe 300 to have various words size. And the next thing to do is to be able to maintain them attached to each other. So I want to keep them side by side and attached to each other. And to do that, since we have zeroed out the minimum and we have a value of 300 in the scale X, and since we have zeroed out the X gap on your clones, we can just go further in our effector random in the parameters subgroup. you can go in the other subgroup and just enter the same value that you had in the scale X in the spacing here. So if I have, let's say 300, I can just type 300 in the spacing and have a look at what happens. Yeah, you have exactly all your clones are still touching each other with various width, which is exactly what we want in order to recreate this kind of coding stuff, right? You have some worlds of different width. So if I have a look at the animation here, I have something pretty cool on its own. You can use it in a lot of situations to create interesting patterns. And yeah, this is it for this part, but this is not some code yet. The next thing you have to do is to adapt the animation mode, because for the moment you have not the impression of code, you have the impression of organic lines. And to do that, you can just change the random mode here by default on Wiggle to change for the random, for example, and you have now something that will change over time in a cut way, which is way more adapted for coding lines. You can also change it for Gaussian blur, because it's a nice way to animate that as well, and I love the way it behaves for coding lines. It will move subtly, and yeah, I like that. So I will stay with the Gaussian mode for this purpose. If you want to animate it more with more speed, you can just play with the animation speed here and onto something like 4 or 10 if you want something really more chaotic. And yeah, I love the way each words change over time. So I will leave it like this. Sorry. Another thing that you want to do is not to colorize them randomly like that, because again, if you take a look at code editor, you have some different colors for each kind of coding method and words. So you have strings in red, you have keywords in blue, you have some yellowish and grays. Yeah, this is the color scheme I want, because it's the After Effects code editor's one, but you can adapt it for any kind of other coding softwares like Visual Studio Code if you want to. So how do you do that? Again, we will reuse our previous technique, which is to have just some grayscales and to recolorize it with the Colorama effect. So retake your layer here, and in the parameters you have the style subgroup, and in the style subgroup I don't want to change the fill hue, which is on by default, which is one turn. I don't want that, so I will zero it out as well. So now I don't have any color variations, but I will change the fill brightness here. So I will enter in the fill brightness 100. Of course, this is a grayish, almost fluo grayish color by default, so it won't work for us. I have to go back to the Moglyph cloner that we had created, and in the transform options here of the Moglyph cloner, you have the fill color, which is this gray. I will change it to be pure black. And to do that, I will just do so. And since this is now pure black, and since we have zeroed out the minimum in the Effector random, and we have the maximum fill brightness to 100, I should have now some different grayscales from black to white, which is exactly what I want. So this is almost finished for this part. The last thing I want to do, and before that, let's rescale and downsize downscale a bit the lines of code because it's way too much for me. So something like, yeah, you go to MoglyphCloner, transform, you can re-downsize it a bit to be more like a code of lines. Okay, and now you just have to select your code lines again and search for the effect called Colorama, just like in the previous parts. So color correction and Colorama. And again, if you go to output cycle, go to interpolate palette, just untick this option, and you can create your own color scheme for that. So the problem that you see here is due to the a thin pixel of stroke color. So to be able to solve this issue, just be sure to, in the MoglyphCloner, to have the same stroke color than the fill color. So pick the fill color, which is pure black, with the stroke color, and in the Effector random, be sure to have the fill brightness and the stroke brightness to be 100 as well. So by doing that, you will remove the incorrect pixels. And now you have something that is perfect. Okay, so this is it for the Effector random. You can twill up this one for now and go back to the Colorama. So as you can see, if you have some code editors in After Effects, you have some white, light gray, yellowish, reddish, and bluish colors for your color scheme. And just change the color as you want. I will do so by, yeah, this is my white and grayish, light gray words. This will be my yellowish color. Okay, and this will be the reddish color here, and the blue. You could even add some comments with the green, but for now I will stay with that, and I will just remove the colors I don't want and just play with the different cursors here to have more or less of a few colors. If you want to have, let's say, more white variables colors, and yeah, something like this, for example. Okay, you can even double the colors if you need to have way more of a specific color. And yeah, this is cool. So perfect, this is exactly what I want. And now the only thing that I have to do is to have the so if I show the layer controls, as you can see, this is a layer that is perfectly centered. It's a grid, okay, that is centered on its anchor point. So I will have to cut and to mask out the left half of this layer, and to do that I can just use a mask and just click on that. Okay, and yeah, I can just create this mask and something like that. Okay, I can do the invert. Okay, perfect. And I will just align this with yeah, the separator I've created before. And yeah, as you can see, there are some white space at the end of a line, which is great because each line is not the same length. And yeah, it works pretty well. You have a decent coding stuff happening there. And the last part of this tutorial is how to have some random white spaces here between some lines and between some indents here. So first thing to do is to actually, let's reduce again the Y scale on this one. It's too big again. Okay. Yeah, And before doing the white space stuff, we have to recreate some spacing between each clones, because of course each word is separated by a white space like that. Okay, I've forgotten to show you that. And to do so, I will just use a simple plain effector. So select your code lines, select your Animate tab and click on plain effector. By default, each clone will go up and will colorize, but if you click on reset, it will remove the effect. And the problem with that is that the plain effector will still act on the colors. And I don't want that, because the colors come from the random effector. So the way to fix this is to play with the order of your effectors, just like you would do in Cinema 4D. So just twill down the text subgroup here and put your effector plane before your random effector. This is a way to fix the issue. Or if you undo this, you could even remove the color from the plain effector, and to do so you have some helpful options in the head matte panel. So you can select your effector plane in the effect panel, go to the head matte panel, you can uncheck all the properties here from the FX parameters and just select all the color stuff that I want to remove. So I want to remove exactly all these parts of the style options. So I will select my effector, and with these options ticked on, I will just click on remove, which is this plus minus icon here. So if I do that, as you can see, all the color info have been removed from my effector plane. So, okay, this is it, and we take back your code lines layer again and go to the effector plane, and effector plane, twill down your parameters subgroup and play with the other options where you have the spacing, and this is where I will re-add some spacing between my words. Okay, as you can see, 0 means that all my clones are still touching each other, but if I play with spacing, with a positive value, I can now add some white spaces between each word, which is exactly what I want for a text editor. Okay, I want more white spaces here at the end of some lines, and to do that, I want to go to the code lines again, MoglyphFX, and this is the number of the columns here. That is too big, because I have 7, which is too big for me, and if I downsize it a bit by adding 5, let's say, or 6 maybe, yeah, you have something. Oh, I prefer 5 in my case. You have still some longer lines and some shorter lines, and this is great. I would like to have more variations again in my in the width of my words, and to do that you can go back to the effector random again, and you can go to transform and other, and again, this is a reminder, if you play with the scale X and you change that, if I enter, for example, 400, as you can see, the spacing is not good anymore. You have to change it in the spacing as well, so 400 here, and yeah, this is nice. You have something pretty cool too. Okay, this is it for the white space between words. I have now to deal with white space between some lines. I want to leave some lines empty to give the illusion to have some vertical spacing and missing lines, just like there, for example. Okay, and to do that, I will rely on plain effector only, which is pretty simple, but will work perfectly for that too. And with so just select again your Moglyph coding lines layer and select it, and before I click in Plane Effector, I will just ensure that it will not create these options anymore. So I want to create all these options except these ones, because I don't want each time I apply a plane effector to recolorize my effector random. Okay, it will override the colors from effector random, so I don't want that. And you have a nice option that is called FX parameters option, that is called don't use unchecked helpmates FX parameters. And I will leave this option on before clicking this option, but if I do so by default, don't use unchecked helpmates FX parameters, it will use them and not them. This is exactly the inverse I want. So I will just sorry, I will, where is, yes, this is this option here, invert all the checkboxes values in the panel above. So if you click on this one, let's see what happened. Okay, now you have inverted the selection. So it means that if I click on plane effector now, with this option selected, it will just add these properties and not this one, which is exactly what I want. So select your Moglyph code lines layer again, and with this option on, I will click on plane. It will move all your clones again up by default, but this is not what I want. And I will reset it again, and I will just deploy the parameters transform and find the visibility, which is 100 by default. And if I zero out the visibility, I will hide all my clones, which is exactly what I want, because I want to be able to mask some of the lines, right? And yeah, and you can just go to select your effector plane again, which is the one that is used now to mask some lines out. And if I select it and play with the fall off, okay, and if you play with the completion, as you can see, it will help you animate your text for a writing effect, but this is not what I want. I don't want to animate from clones to clones, from glyph to glyph, but I want to animate by lines. And to do that, you just have to select your effector plane. And in the Animate tab, you have the linear fall off here. And if I select my effector plane in the effector panel and click on this linear fall off, as you can see, it will adapt the fall off options. And now if I play with this option, I can animate this from lines. And this is what I want. But I want to be able to have it randomized, because I don't want to animate this from range. I want to randomize this fall off. And to do so, again, select your effector plane too in the effector panel and click on randomize fall off order. And now, if I play with the completion to %, okay, I have some random lines disappearing, which is exactly what I want, right? So yeah, this is it. This is the option to check if you want to randomize the white spacing between lines. The problem is that it won't be animated, but you could animate it just by playing with the random source here. Okay, so if you, let's say, the effector random is animated with a value of 10 and animation speed, okay, so you could randomize the source by alt-clicking on the randomized source here. So alt-click, and just, if I solo these parameters, just enter mat round time multiplied by 10. And now if I press play, I have some random lines disappearing over time, which is exactly what a code editor would display, right? So this is cool, we are almost there. So the last thing I want to do is to add some indentation. Indentation is what happens when you have this here. As you can see, some of the lines are indented with white space before the lines. And this is what I want to recreate this as well. So if I don't want that much white space between lines, I can just go back to my layer and play with the completion too, and have a smaller value, let's say 20 for example, or 15 maybe. Okay, yeah, this is great. And to do that, I will just duplicate my layer. Okay, so duplicate. I will solo this one here, and I will remove the mask. Okay, I will just use in the object, so you can remove the Colorama effect. I will stay with one clone on one column only. Okay, and I will just go to transform and rescale it a bit on the y-axis. So if yeah, this is exactly what I want. And I want to not randomize my clones. Okay, so I will leave it like this. Yeah, yes, this is exactly what I want. I don't want my effector to randomize the lines because I want some regular indents here. So I will uncheck the effector random, or I could even remove it correctly from the stack. So I can select it, go to Help Matte panel, and remove effect by clicking this option here. Okay, and I can rescale my clones on X like this, and this will be the half part of this will be the width of my indentation. So I can play with the scale X until I am satisfied with width. And the important thing is not to go too far here in the scale Y. So I will leave it to 50, for example. The most important thing is to be bigger than the code of lines below. Okay. So now that I've done that, I can just take my code length and mask out with the alpha matte here, and the alpha inverted here. And now, if I rename this matte, I can just play with the values of my effector plane. Okay. And the random source here, if you double click on this one, it have kept, of course, the same expressions than before. And remember that I had this expression to auto-animate the random source of my white space here. But of course, I don't want the same thing. So I will change the source just by going in this matte runtime here, and I will add plus something like crazy number like 1000, for example, and I will go to there, and again I will just play with the completion too. And since this is an alpha inverted, I will just play with this value to have more or less lines indented. So 100 will mean that you don't have any indentation. Okay, but if I have something like 80, for example, I will have some of the lines indented here. So let's play with this number until I am satisfied. Yeah, I have a nice here indentation of 2 lines, which is exactly what I want, and it will reproduce the thing I've created here. So now, if I press play, I have something that looks really like a visual expression editor. So this is pretty cool. And this concludes the tutorial about how to recreate some After Effects components. I hope you guys have learned something new, especially some new techniques with MoglyphFX. Sorry again for the length of the tutorial. I know it's pretty long, but yeah, MoglyphFX is pretty deep as a tool and needs some precise and deep tutorials. If you love MoglyphFX, don't hesitate to share your love. And if you have any question, you can post it as a comment below. Hope you guys will like it, and see you later for other crazy stuff. Bye guys!